Hey, how's it going? This concept video is called When Not to Use Game Theory. So, obviously, the most obvious answer when not to use game theory in your poker game, um, and by game theory I mean optimal game theory. Obviously, game theory includes all sorts of different strategies for games, but what I'm talking about is when not to use optimal play. And so, the most obvious answer would be to exploit weaker opponents. Optimal play is going to assume that your opponent knows and can adjust to your strategy, and you know and can adjust to your opponent's strategy. And when only the second part of that is true, there are going to be more profitable ways to play, obviously. Um, Many opponents are oblivious to your strategy, or they're incapable of properly adjusting. For example, a lot of times you have an overall tendency for a player. They fold too much or call too much. And then a player that folds too much or calls too much, you might want to start, bluffing him all the time if he folds too much, or just never bluffing him if he calls too much. And you might be afraid that he would notice. So you'll be able to tell like someone doesn't adjust. Some of these might not be obvious to you right away. Others will be, but one thing you can do is start getting out of line a little bit and see if he adjusts. So you might have an opponent who plays too many tables. It's pretty common not to use tracking software, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're incapable or that you're going to be oblivious to your opponent's strategy, but it makes it a lot more likely. And of course, the live poker example would be, someone like watching movies on his iPad. Um, you might know that that player folds too much, and you can just raise his blind every time. And if he's watching stuff on his iPad, he won't even notice who it is that's raising his blind. He might just say, "Oh, it's on me. I have to put chips in. I fold over and over again." So these are definitely opponents where you can exploit them, and sometimes you can really exploit them quite a bit and go well beyond what an optimal strategy would be. Open way more hands, or just never bluff, or however it might be. Other opponents are simply going to be unable to adjust. Most recreational players, I would say, fit in this category. Many players, they want to gamble, and they just aren't going to consider folding more often as a strategic adjustment. It's especially going to be more likely in live poker, or someone that's one tabling an online tournament or whatever. But if your primary purpose for playing is entertainment and gambling and whatever, um, the fact that someone is putting money in against you and never bluffing might not be a reason for you to fold, because if you fold nothing, it's not fun. You don't get to play. Um, so these types of players may be aware that if you raise to 5 times the big blind when after they limp, or 6 times or 10 times or whatever, they may be aware that you're not playing an optimal strategy, and that you're never bluffing and that you have a big hand, but they just aren't going to be able to adjust because they are here to gamble. The other type is a little bit less common, but you'll certainly encounter these players as well, and they're extremely risk averse, and they'd rather wait for a better spot than gamble and risk losing. And again, this might apply more to live poker, or at least be an easier read to make in live poker, though online players are certainly guilty of this as well. This sort of player may be aware that you're bluffing him very often, but he doesn't want to risk losing. He might be in a spot where he can call and win 60% of the time, and that's very plus EV, but he doesn't want to risk losing 40% of the time. And so this is someone, again, where you don't really want to have anything resembling a balanced strategy. Um, it doesn't matter that he's onto you or whatever. He's going to wait until he's sure that he's going to win the hand to not fold. So, obviously go ahead and bluff this guy as much as you can. Another type of weak opponent that you want to exploit is opponents that aren't capable of correctly understanding your strategy. Um, Again, some of this stuff is going to apply more to live poker, because people uh, talk more about what they're thinking, and even if they don't talk about what they're thinking, just their mannerisms, the timing that they act with, whatever, give away what they're thinking. But this can definitely be true online as well. It's pretty easy to spot a weaker player just from bad mechanics, like limping a lot or whatever. And a lot of these are going to be fallacies that weaker players will have that will allow you to exploit them. So one example is he might mistake a short stack shove with a weak hand for an overall loose and crazy strategy. This is an easy one you can take advantage of in really any kind of poker, is that if you get down to 10 big blinds and shove all in with Jack 7 suited, and someone calls you and you suck out on him, a weaker player is often going to think of you as a loose and crazy player at all stack sizes and in all situations. You went all in with what he considers a bad hand, and he's going to perceive that as you're someone that's willing to gamble and put money in with bad hands. Obviously, if the hand was against that particular opponent, it's going to be emotionally a lot more. Emotionally, it will just be a lot bigger deal to him, and so I think that's going to be your surest bet. Another example of this, he might mistake early position tightness for overall tightness. I feel like, for example, if I'm maybe a little bit card dead, or I've just decided to take a tighter strategy, especially like in early position, and I shut down a few good hands when I open under the gun or whatever, players are going to be more likely to raise my blind very wide because they think that means I won't call a lot, when in fact I'm calling very frequently in the big blind. So that's another example where you can deviate from game theory and play loose in the positions where you want to play loose, because your tightness in other positions is misleading someone. And the last example would be someone that rigidly adheres to stereotypes about age, race, gender, etc. I have talked to some friends that are female players, and they really go pretty hard on this one, especially. I think age and race can also affect people's perceptions, but the stereotypes that people have about how a woman is going to play poker are really strongly held, and they're going to cause them to play pretty badly. So I think that's an example where if you're a woman, you can really play a lot more loosely and aggressively, and people just aren't going to be capable of understanding what you're doing, or that you're bluffing them a lot, because it doesn't fit with their stereotype they have about women. So the other reason why you would want to deviate from an optimal game theory play, or the reason to be unbalanced, would be exploiting the metagame. So the metagame is how a player or group of players is expected to play, and you can look at this in all different ways. The group could be, for example, it could be no limit hold'em players. Almost all no limit hold'em players have regardless of its cash games, tournaments, whatever, have a pretty high probability that they'll make a lot of continuation bets. They'll bet in position or out of position or whatever. They'll bet after raising pre-flop. They'll put in a bet on the flop. A more specific example would be that in tournaments, players tend to open for a smaller raise. Note that what I'm describing here is not necessarily a flaw in the metagame. It's not something that is necessarily a good strategy or a bad strategy, but it's a commonly used strategy that you can expect your opponents to have. Even more specific example would be online high stakes tournament players tend to aggressively 3-bet, 4-bet, and 5-bet. You should notice this pretty quickly. If you're watching like the Big 11 versus Scoop 2K, the table from the Scoop 2K is going to have big piles of chips all over it from people cold 5-betting and stuff like that. The Big 11 is going to have a bunch of limps and maybe one raise or whatever. So that's a different metagame. So most non-opponent specific exploitive play has some element of metagaming in it. Basically, when you do something and it's not that your opponent fits into one of the categories from the first part of this video, or some other category. When it's not an opponent-specific play, but it's something that you expect to work, um, but you don't expect it to necessarily be part of like a game theory balanced strategy, what you're doing is metagaming. So an example here is a river bluff raise might get more credit because usually river raises are for value. If you look at regardless of whether it's tournaments or cash games or whatever, if you were PokerStars and you could look up everyone's hole cards and see, you would see that a disproportionate amount of river raises are going to be for value. Players are rarely making river bluff raises, so you might make a river bluff raise and expect to get away with it, not because you're balancing it with whatever value hand, but because you just don't expect your opponent will put you on a bluff. So another example of this would be if you're a total unknown player in a high stakes tournament like like a 2K or something like I mentioned before online. When you first get to the table, you might get away with under bluffing on your 3 bets, 4 bets, and 5 bets because the metagame is that everyone has plenty of bluffs when they 3 bet and 4 bet, and so no one's going to be expecting your first 3 bet at the table to be for value or whatever. So if you're an unknown, you might get away with, of course, after you've been there for a few orbits, people will notice what your frequencies are and whatever, but to start out, you can exploit the metagame. Even against good players, you're not going to get a whole lot of credit on your 3 bets right away, so you can exploit that and make sure that, maybe you're bluffing occasionally, but not as often as you might have to be in terms of game theory. So the difference between exploiting weak players and exploiting the metagame is exploiting the metagame actually works better against stronger players, assuming you're an unknown. If a player hasn't had any information about you, he's going to assume that you play the way everyone else does in that particular field, whatever it is. And strong opponents are usually winning against the field by a lot, partly because they have a game plan that's adjusted to how the field plays. Their style is good against the way everyone else is playing because they have an idea. For example, they're willing to fold a strong hand on the river to a raise because they realize people don't bluff raise a lot. So our previous example of a river raise that will get extra credit because it's an uncommon play to bluff raise is actually going to work better against a strong opponent. He's going to be capable of laying down a good hand because he realizes it's only a bluff catcher. Whereas a weak player might go, oh well, I've got 2 pair, I've got to call. 2 pair is a strong hand, not realizing that your value range is going to be all hands, better than his 2 pair or whatever. The caveat to this is, remember, you may be less unknown than you think. Someone might have Googled your name if you're playing online. If you're playing on live, they might have seen you talking to a well-respected player on the break, or someone that they, even if not a well-respected player, someone they've played against before and think is good. They might have old hands in their Poker Tracker database of how you've played in the past, whatever. So be careful with this metagame stuff. If you're someone who's a really crazy player or whatever, really aggressive, someone might be aware of that you don't think. So don't get too carried away. But like I said, overall, non-opponent specific, when you really come down to it, you may not have analyzed this before, but non-specific, opponent-specific exploitive play basically is metagaming. And so if you think of it along those lines, that can help guide you in terms of thinking of why your unbalanced plays are good, and they quite frequently are. Like I said about strong players winning because they have a game plan that's adjusted to how the field plays. In most poker games, game theory based, like optimally balanced strategy is not going to be the most winning strategy, though of course by definition, since your opponents aren't perfect, it is always going to win, but it's not going to win the most. So that does it for this video. As usual, feel free to post any questions, comments, whatever.